Thank you for joining us. This is Brennain Lloyd with Northwatch, and this is the third in our series of online workshops related to nuclear waste in Canada. Today's session is Burying Trouble, and it is a backgrounder on deep geological repositories for nuclear waste. We have done two earlier presentations, one a backgrounder called Nuclear Waste. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar, Burying Trouble. This is a backgrounder on deep geological repositories for nuclear waste, and it is the third in our four-part series of online webinars. The first was an introductory overview session. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation on deep geological repositories. This is a third session in a four-week series on nuclear waste repositories. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation. It's titled Burying Trouble. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation. This is the third in a series of webinars, four-part series. The first session was an introductory. The second was an overview of regulations in Canada for nuclear facilities. This afternoon's session is Burying Trouble, deep geological repositories for nuclear waste, and it is a backgrounder to the fourth presentation, which is an overview of how different countries evaluate or assess proposals for the burial of nuclear waste. My name is Brennain Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch, and I am Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation on deep geological repositories for nuclear waste. This is the third in a four-part series. The first presentation was an overview or background presentation. The second was an overview of regulations in Canada for nuclear facilities. This afternoon's presentation, Burying Trouble, is a backgrounder to next week's presentation, which is on how different countries evaluate proposals for nuclear waste burial. Our objectives this afternoon are to provide that background by identifying some of the common elements, ingredients, or aspects of nuclear waste burial proposals that appear in several different countries' concepts or proposals, and then briefly describe some of those different countries' proposals, including Canada's, and identify some of the outstanding technical challenges or the scientific uncertainties related to these various proposals. And this is as background information to the final workshop in our series, which is about how countries evaluate different proposals. We'd like to begin by identifying some common terms and language, then some of the key concepts or key aspects or elements of the concepts as they appear internationally. Talk a little bit about Canadian experience, the background here in Canada, and then look at some select examples, certainly not at every country that is considering nuclear waste burial, but at some select examples, and then touch briefly on some of the scientific issues and the uncertainties related to these various proposals. The language that I'm going to summarize is the terminology that we'll hear in these proposals. And I'll say at the outset that I'm going to use much of the language of the proponents and the regulators and some of their descriptions of the concepts. The terms are used commonly in the discussion of deep geological repositories, and we are adopting some of that language in this presentation, but we have not adopted the concept as a sound option for the long-term management or isolation or containment of nuclear waste. In fact, it's both my own view and that of Northwatch's that the technical case has not been made. The scientific uncertainties are outstanding, and we don't have confidence that they will be resolved at any time in the near future. But we will adopt some of the languages and some of the description for the purpose of our being able to engage in this discussion with the regulators, with the proponents, and with our communities, as 21 different communities in Canada are being studied as possible burial sites. So some of the key terms. Closure is a term and decommissioning is a term that are closely linked but are used differently in different contexts. Closure in the context of deep geological repositories means it's the end of that period when the waste is being placed in the repository. The repository is being closed out. It's the end of that operating life, not necessarily the moment when it's going to be decommissioned. In repositories of this nature, generally decommissioning follows after a closure, period of closure, and might signal the end of active monitoring. Crystalline rock is the rock of the Canadian Shield. It's called crystalline rock, granite, often referred to as igneous rocks or intrusive igneous rock formations. Deep geological repositories are also referred to as disposal facility, deep geological disposal facilities, as repositories. They're all different common terms that refer to placing high-level waste or other forms of radioactive waste deep underground. The design life is a term that's used in many different contexts, commonly in the Canadian regulatory system for other nuclear facilities. Design life means the period which a facility or a container or a reactor is expected to perform according to its technical specifications. No promises made after that period. So, for example, the design life of a dry storage container might be 50 years. Earlier predictions, statements by industry was design life was 50 years. Now we hear 50 to 100 years. Reactor design life, it might be 40 years. They might operate for 20 years and require refurbishment. But design life means the period of time that they're expected to operate according to their specifications. Disposal versus storage is a important distinction in the language. So disposal means to place it in a condition that you don't intend to retrieve it again. So geological disposal concept meant that the waste was going to be placed in that repository and not retrieved. Storage means that it's being placed in that condition for a period of time, and retrieval is intended to be possible. Retrieval or retrievability is the ability to remove the waste, to take it from its current condition, and so in the case of a repository, an underground repository, to retrieve the waste would mean to be able to bring it back to surface, either for reprocessing, which we don't do in Canada at present, or for repackaging if the containers were failing, although that is generally not a purpose that is included in the descriptions put forward by the nuclear industry, such as the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Half-life is the amount of time it takes a radionuclide to decay to reduce its radioactivity by 50%. And it does that by moving to the next stage in the decay process. So it doesn't mean that it's reduced itself by 50% and it's, the other 50% of radioactivity is just poof gone. It means that it is decayed, it's moved on to the next stage in the decay chain. And in so doing, it has given off radiation, it's given off energy, radioactivity as part of that decay process. Sedimentary rock is a type of rock we find in southern Ontario, and it's now included in the site search by the nuclear industry for a geological repository or a nuclear waste burial site. You'll often also hear the term Ordovician sedimentary rock, and that includes rocks like the shale and limestone around the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. Safety has different connotations or different meanings. So in the regulator's language and in the proponent's language, they often refer to as safety. Safety in that context means that it is going to meet the regulatory standard. It's defined by regulation. And passive safety means that it doesn't require ongoing human activity, and it doesn't require it. Active safety means it does require it. So an example would be when nuclear fuel waste is in the irradiated fuel bay, the pool within the reactor station. That's active management. So the regulators would refer to that as active safety. But what it means is that it requires a constant input of electricity, water, maintenance, and so on. Passive safety would, in using that same example or context, passive safety would be a dry storage container where it is a passive management system. It doesn't require an ongoing input of water, electricity, human management. Sievert is one of the several different ways of measuring radioactivity. A sievert is the unit that measures biological damage caused by radiation. Underground characterization facility is a stage in the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's many-step process. It is when the proponent of a proposed geological repository actually moves underground and begins to do real-world characterization of the proposed rock formation or of the selected rock formation to determine if the predictions it made about the rock characteristics are actual or not. In the Nuclear Waste Management Organization process, that underground characterization facility comes at step 8. Right now in Finland, the movie Into Eternity, that is about the underground characterization facility in Finland, and they are characterizing the rock and potentially will move to an environmental assessment for that same facility to become a deep repository, a deep geological repository. Used nuclear fuel is the fuel waste. That's the irradiated fuel bundles that have been removed from the reactor itself, from the reactor core. There are other forms of nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste. Internationally, the terminology spent fuel is generally reserved for the fuel bundles, and high-level waste refers to reprocessing waste. So high-level waste includes nuclear fuel waste, the fuel bundles, and reprocessing waste. In Canada, we use the term high-level waste to refer only to the spent fuel or the used nuclear fuel or the nuclear fuel waste. It's referred to in several different ways. But internationally, the distinction tends to be spent fuel, and high-level waste. High-level waste including reprocessing waste and weapons waste. So key elements of a nuclear waste repository concepts. These are concepts, these are elements that appear repeatedly through a number of different concepts put forward internationally by different proponents in various countries looking at geological repositories. So we're going to look briefly at the multi-barrier concept itself, at different design elements, and at the footprint of geological repositories. So the multi-barrier concept is at the core of many countries, or perhaps all countries, geological repository concepts or proposals or plans. And it is an idea that the waste is contained through a series of barriers. And those barriers are both engineered and finally the final barrier in geological disposal concepts or geological repositories is the rock itself. So you begin at the core with the waste. And then generally speaking, there's a metal container. Sometimes there's a super container or an overpack. Then a buffer material, bentonite, clay, sometimes concrete, sometimes a mix of these. Sometimes there's a more dense fill closer to the waste and a less dense fill further from the waste. And then the final barrier, theoretically at least, is the geology, is the rock. So these different barriers are to work in combination to keep the waste isolated from the environment over long periods of time. The challenge is that the waste must be isolated from the environment for very, very, very long periods of time, literally for longer than it is we have any human experience on the scale of. For millions of years, the waste will continue to be radioactive. The proposals generally have a expectation put forward by the proponents that they will retain the waste, they will isolate the waste for a very long period of time, but perhaps not for the very, 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 very long period of time required. And if we look back to an earlier Canadian proposal, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's concept, geological disposal concept, the industry in that review made no commitment or made no promise that the waste would be kept in isolation into perpetuity. It was for a very long period of time, very similar to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's multi-barrier concept. Design and engineering elements, there are several which we've identified as the key elements. This is maybe consider it or compare it to a recipe. You're cooking up a solution to the very long-term problem of nuclear waste and how to isolate it from the environment. And you've got some ingredients in that recipe that appears in the various recipes. Some of the same ingredients appear recipe after recipe. There are variations on the theme, but these are the common ingredients in these recipes for geological repositories. So waste, access, containers, placement, spacing, backfill, monitoring are all aspects that are given slightly different treatment, but are given attention in each of the geological repository concepts. So the waste itself is a variable. So there are three different major types of nuclear power plants in the world. Most common are light water reactors. Second most common is heavy water reactors. Like we have in Canada, the CANDU design is a heavy water reactor. And these reactors produce a different type of waste, and the waste will have different characteristics in terms of its how hot it is, what its decay rate is, and so on. There's also a third type of reactor called a Generation 3 reactor, which is the next generation. If new reactors were to be built in Canada, they would potentially be Generation 3 reactors. And these reactors have what's called a higher burn-up. So the fuel waste that comes out of the reactor is much hotter. The thermal load is much greater. And so that has consequences for any kind of storage system or containment system in the longer term because of greater cooling requirements, greater spacing requirements in a repository, and so on. So the type of waste, the volume of waste, and the characteristics of the waste are all factors that must be factored into the design of the repository. Access is another obvious and key element of a repository design. So on the left, there's an image of a vertical shaft. This is the image that appears repeatedly through the series of Canadian repository designs over the last several decades. On the right is a ramp access, which is quite consistent through the different international designs. So the vertical shaft has some cost advantages, but has additional challenges around things like designing it to be able to withstand the very, very, very heavy loads. Whereas the ramp access provides some more options in terms of how you manage that payload, but it is a longer access route and has greater cost implications. Different container designs. There are two basic container designs. One is a copper container. Pictured on the upper image is a copper container from the Swedish design, perhaps the most frequently referenced container design and repository design internationally at present, presumably because it is the only one that is currently in a licensing process. So there's much more detailed work has been done. On the lower image is a carbon steel container from the Switzerland design, the Swiss design, which is still pretty much in the planning stages. Generally speaking, there appears to be a preference for the copper container in a wetter underground environment and the carbon container in a drier underground environment. And frequently or generally, these containers will be coupled or can be coupled with a steel insert and potentially an overpack or a super container. There are many different options in terms of the placement of the waste, at least at the design level. I'm going to show you three different major sets of placement options. So the first set is in tunnel. So in tunnel means that a horizontal tunnel is created, and then there are boreholes created within that tunnel, either in the wall of the tunnel or in the floor of the tunnel. So the image to the left shows a in-floor or a vertical borehole. In the middle, an in-wall or a horizontal borehole. And on the extreme right, it's similarly a horizontal borehole, but with buffer material added. So a variation on that is to have an in-tunnel placement design, but with a super container. So you have a larger container, and the different options within that design group are you can have the borehole sized close to the same size as the container, or you can have the borehole sized larger to allow more buffer material, or more buffer material, and they can be different buffer materials. For example, if it's a repository being designed in a salt formation, most likely the design will include or assume a salt buffer, salt material as a buffer. If it's a repository in a rock formation such as the Canadian Shield granite or crystalline rock of the Canadian Shield or Sweden, then it would be a bentonite clay buffer. Another option, so the in-tunnel or the borehole option is one major grouping of placement options. Another major grouping of placement options is in-cavern placement. And this is also sometimes referred to as in-room placement. So it's a larger opening and a larger container is placed within that cavern or that room, and then buffer material is packed around that, either clay or concrete. A third set of placement options are deep boreholes. Now, both in-floor and in-cavern options have been included in Canadian concepts or Canadian plans to date. There has not been in any of the Canadian designs to date the option of deep boreholes. This is part of the international discussion. It is perhaps more conceptual than design or plan material at this point. But there's two variations on the deep boreholes. One is the image on the left you'll see has two matrices. It's a matrix option. So there's two levels, and the idea is that boreholes are drilled from one level to the level, from the upper level to the lower level. And then the containers are placed within those boreholes that go between the two levels. And there's buffer material placed below and between each of the containers. And then on the upper level, there is buffer material placed to fill in that access shaft where the boreholes were drilled from. The one on the right is called a very deep borehole, and it is the idea that you would drill from surface to depths of 500 to 1,000 meters, and you would place the fuel containers at that very deep depth, at the borehole and bottom of the borehole, or there may be buffer material placed first and then the container. And that is a design which no country to date has adopted, perhaps for good reason. Spacing is another important consideration, and spacing is influenced by all of the other decisions. Each of these design elements are influenced by other decisions that are made. But one of the most important requirements of a repository design is that it keep the temperature below 100 degrees centigrade. There are real identified failures with the buffer material if the repository temperature goes above 100 degrees, goes above boiling. And so the intent is to keep the repository temperature below 100 degrees, and that then reduces some of the impairments to the different barriers within the multiple barrier system. So spacing is developed looking at the waste itself, the container design, the placement design, the rock characteristics, many different considerations have to be placed, kept in place for the spacing to actually be determined. The backfill is one of those barriers that we saw back when we looked in the earlier slide at the multiple barrier concept. So you have the waste container, sometimes a super container, and then the backfill. The backfill is, in many proposals, it's identified specifically as bentonite, which is a clay. In some proposals, it's just identified as a clay-based material. And in many proposals, there are mixes of buffer material moving from a dense buffer material, which is clay, to a less dense, which is concrete, or medium density concrete and clay mixed together. Less dense would be a concrete buffer. So those materials, there's many different options and mixes, and there are some issues, some technical or scientific issues specific to these buffers and their ability to perform according to requirements, specifications, predictions when they're in an underground repository with that mix of heat, chemistry, and so on. We'll discuss that more in the uncertainty section. Monitoring is an element, a requirement of the repository design, and near-term, medium-term, and long-term monitoring are included in various proposals, and they are more or less developed based, that varies proposal to proposal and, over time. But the monitoring must look at things like the container performance, specifically the repository performance overall, and ultimately the monitoring is looking at the migration of the radionuclides, of the radioactivity from the waste containers from the repository out into the surface environment, the air, water environment where we all live. The third major set of considerations in the design of a repository, in a waste repository concept, is the footprint. And there's both the surface footprint and the subsurface footprint. So the surface is the area above the repository, and that's where many of the support functions must take place. So typically those would include the waste receiving building where the truck or train or conveyance brings the waste to the repository site. Typically there's also a repackaging building. There's the waste rock piles, the rock that was underground and was brought to surface to create room for the repository becomes waste rock. It's called waste rock, and so there has to be a area for the surface materials, the material, all the soil that's above the rock, and then all of the rock that must be brought to surface. Typically there will be facilities for manufacturing, managing, processing the different materials that are used in the repository, in particular the buffers and the backfill material. And then there are administration and security buildings within the complex, and in some cases, certainly in the Canadian concept in its current development, contemplates that there may be worker camps as part of the surface facilities, facilities able to accommodate up to 400 workers who would be working at the site during construction in particular. So presumably that indicates that the workers would be from someplace other than the local environment. The manufacturing of the used fuel containers is one part of the project, the larger project, that might or might not take place at the repository location. And this is an example of the real variability in the repository designs and in the surface facility designs in particular. And in the Nuclear Waste Management Organization project, for example, it identifies that container, the used fuel container fabrication plant. They could be manufactured and assembled at the repository site, or they could be manufactured and assembled elsewhere. So there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of what all of those buildings will be on the repository surface, in the surface facilities. The subsurface facilities are typically include the shaft or the access ramps, then the access tunnels, and the placement rooms. And typically the subsurface facilities, the underground repository, is about 3 times larger than the area of the surface facilities. So the Canadian experience, in the early days, we're going to just briefly outline the Canadian experience from the early days through to the near to the present. So the Canadian concept, really, of geological repositories began in 1977 when 3 men for 3 months were asked to study the problem of high-level nuclear fuel waste, and they recommended underground disposal in the Canadian Shield. And all efforts of industry and government since then in Canada have focused on that recommendation of the Hare Commission and have moved forward or backwards from there. So in the late 70s, we had Atomic Energy of Canada Limited doing site investigations, met fairly strenuous local opposition, quite strenuous local opposition in the many communities that they went into, and they did do actual drilling in 2 communities in north of Massey and near Atikokan. And then in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a refocusing of the program, and efforts were then to develop a generic design. So that became the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited concept for deep geological repository or disposal, and it was referred to a federal panel for public review in the late 1980s. Mid-1980s, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's environmental impact statement was issued, and there was a 13-month hearing held in the mid-1990s. Meanwhile, the waste had been being generated, starting in 1945 at the Chalk River Laboratories, 1960s prototype production, 1970s commercial production, and through until the early 1990s when the last reactor in Canada was commissioned. Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's geological disposal concept had a underground repository 500 to 1,000 meters below the surface, the waste placed in copper or titanium containers in either in-floor boreholes or in-room placement. And the ACL concept design was to make the waste irretrievable, and it was to be placed in the Canadian Shield. In 1998, the Seaborne Panel Report was issued, and they had been asked, has Atomic Energy of Canada Limited demonstrated the geological disposal concept to be safe and acceptable? The summary answer is no. Their longer answer was that from a technical perspective, on balance, it's a concept adequately demonstrated, conceptual stage, but from a social perspective, it is not. So that, I think, can be called the faint praise approval for a concept, continued work on the concept of geological disposal or geological repositories, and a resounding failure on the social acceptability. The scientific review group also found a number of technical deficiencies, many of which remain unresolved to this day and are part of the international discussion. So 1998, the panel says ACL concept not found safe or acceptable, and they recommended that an independent agency be created to do future work on this in this area, arm's length from government and industry, and that there be a framework for the participation of Aboriginal people developed by Aboriginal people. 2002, the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act came into law. The federal government said they accepted the Seaborne Panel reports in principle, but in practice, they passed a piece of legislation which directed the industry to create the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is rather the mirror opposite of what the panel had been recommending as a result of their 10 years of considering the challenge of nuclear waste management. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is comprised of the nuclear waste generators. So some select examples of Canadian and international proposals, and these were drawn from a variety of reports, but namely the three that you see on the screen, and those references are on the nonuclearwaste.ca website. So Germany, it's a salt formation, and this repository was actually, the program was put on hold, a moratorium on further work in October 2000, and no further work has been done, but it was a salt container, it was a salt repository, and the waste was to be placed co-located spent fuel and high-level waste. Sweden, it's crystalline or granite rock formations. They have selected a repository location. It is in a reactor community, and in 2011, the company, the proponent SKB, submitted their environmental assessment. It was in November 2012 returned to SKB because of technical deficiencies, mostly related to their safety case and in particular to the corrosion rates for the copper container. Their proposal assumes a copper container with an iron insert, vertical boreholes, and a bentonite buffer, similar to some of the Canadian concepts. Finland, they are also crystalline rock formation. They have a site characterization facility under construction and will be submitting an environmental assessment in the next few years. And their characterization facility, if they received a environmental assessment or licensing approval to proceed to repository construction stage, the characterization facility would become the access system for that repository. And this is the repository that the characterization facility is featured in the film, the documentary film Into Eternity. France, they have identified a candidate location. There's a high level of public opposition. It's in a clay or mudstone environment, and it is a steel overpack. And many uncertainties with this, mostly related to the short-term period of time that the experiments have been conducted in, and the repository structures haven't been tested, and there's some outstanding issues around fractures and their ability to self-seal as the design would require them to do. The United Kingdom has not selected, like Canada, has not selected a geological formation. They are in they issued a call for expressions of interest, had only 2 communities express interest. They were both within the county of Cumbria, and in January 2013, the county council rejected the option, or rejected the program, which means that no further work should be done on those 2 locations. The United States, the media was volcanic tuff. This is Yucca Mountain, and for many years it was thought to be the most advanced, but there were many, many technical issues, many technical uncertainties related to this particular repository proposal and design. And in 2009, its budget was frozen, and now it has been removed, taken off the table, and there was a Blue Ribbon Commission appointed by the President, and they have released their recommendations for a new process, voluntary consent-based siting process. It assumes centralized storage, and it assumes a deep geological repository as an endpoint. Legislation is expected sometime within the next few months in the United States, so spring of 2013 presumably. Canada, the geological media has not yet been determined. Either the crystalline formations of the Canadian Shield or sedimentary rock of the southern Ontario, an interesting deviation from the Hare Commission recommendations, which had the granite formations of the Canadian Shield or salt as their secondary recommendation, but no, they did not recommend the sedimentary formations. The Nuclear Fuel Waste Act was passed in 2002, and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was created, and in 2005 they submitted their report recommending what they called adaptive phased management. And adaptive phase management is a package. It includes a siting process, it includes a geological repository, it includes a post-operation period, which in some descriptions goes for as long as 300 years for the entire project. In some of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization descriptions, it's a much shorter period of time. So the Canadian concept, waste would be assumes a copper container, and there are just over 2 million bundles have already been produced, but they assume 4 million bundles as of the most recent publications. 3.6 million bundles is also in many of the NWMO recent materials. So that's about 50,000 metric tons at present. So and then rising exponentially with increased volumes. If new reactors were built, there would be then a new fuel type from if there was a generation 3, and that would be a higher burn up, and so a hotter waste that would require then different considerations for things like the containers and the spacing and so on. The Canadian concept always shows a shaft. All the illustrations show a shaft, but in the NWMO project description issued in October 2012, they actually said through a shaft or a ramp, but all of the descriptions and all of the illustrations certainly show a shaft as the access. The containers are assumed to be a copper container. That's the reference design, a copper container with a steel inner with the option of a super container, so an extra container around that fuel, around that initial container. The NWMO has not selected a placement option. They're looking at vertical boreholes or horizontal placement. Spacing would be determined by the fuel type, the placement design, and the container design, but the NWMO has acknowledged that there would need to be spacing designs to ensure that the repository doesn't go above boiling, so it doesn't go above 100 degrees Celsius. The buffer materials, similar to the international discussions, the buffer materials are assumed to be bentonite or bentonite clay mix. Closer is the dense backfill moving out to a mix with bentonite and sand for the less dense buffer materials. Monitoring, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in October 2012 put out their first detailed discussion of monitoring, and it is actually a discussion about how to develop a monitoring program. They have offered one illustration as to what the post-closure monitoring might look at. The challenge is, of course, if you have access for monitoring, it's not a sealed repository, so it creates additional opportunities for migration of the radionuclides to the surface. So the one illustration the NWMO has offered to date, and this was offered in 2005 but is repeated in more recent documents, is there would be a borehole drilled at post-closure, and they would place a data logger at the bottom of that borehole, then fill it with sealing material. 20 years later, remove the sealing material, extract the data logger, put in a new data logger, fill it with sealing material again, and so on, presumably into perpetuity. So the surface facilities for the NWMO concept include the standard materials, the standard design of administration buildings and waste packaging and so on, with a secure zone as the inner zone. So on the image to the right, you can see a yellowish zone. That is the protected area. So that would be the most secure. That would be the high security zone. There is very little offered yet in the NWMO concept discussion of what the security accompaniment would be, for example, along transportation routes. And in the surface facilities, there is this large question as to whether some of the support facilities, like manufacturing and assembly of the containers, would be on site or would be some distance. In their some documents, they indicate that it could potentially be located in the community or surrounding region, which suggests that it would be part of the surface facilities. In other documents, the cost assumptions are based on a distance of 1,000 kilometers from the repository. Subsurface facilities would be a series of tunnels and adits, and the space requirements would be determined based on a combination of all of those other factors. There's an assumption that placement rooms would be about 5.5 meters high and about 400 meters long, center-to-center room spacing, so they would be distanced from each other by about 40 meters. So this is a very, very large underground facility. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization's plan, adaptive phase management, their concept for nuclear fuel waste, is not the only proposal currently being put forward in Canada. Ontario Power Generation has a proposal for a deep geological repository for low and intermediate level waste at the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station, and that is currently the subject of an environmental assessment review. Atomic Energy of Canada Limited has a proposal for a deep geological repository at the Chalk River Laboratories on the Ottawa River for legacy waste and operating waste at the Chalk River Lab. So just to finish up, a very brief run-through of some of the scientific uncertainties and the status of the safety case internationally. There are a number of issues, outstanding issues, and these are the same issues that were real technical matters of technical debate in the 1990s during the ACL review. There's still a matter of technical debate and scientific uncertainty. So one is corrosion. At what rate will those copper containers corrode? Research is showing that it may be more rapid than earlier presented, and that the mechanisms of the corrosion are not actually fully understood. Many issues around the performance of the backfill and how that backfill will actually serve to retain or retard the migration of the radionuclides in an underground repository condition where you have that combination, particularly a combination variables in terms of heat and water. Many issues around the solubility, sorption, transport of the radionuclides. So how do these barriers in combination serve to retain the radionuclides in the repository? And lots of issues around the synergy that will happen in that underground repository, and some of the results of that synergy, including buildup of gas pressure, which could damage the barriers. It could fast-track migration of the radionuclides out through particularly the geological formations, which then amplifies all of those uncertainties around bedrock properties and hydrogeologies, all those uncertainties around fractures and faults and how water migrates and gas migrates and moves through rock are amplified in a repository condition. Many issues around the reliability of the modeling, the safety case, rely heavily on computer models and to make those predictions, and many outstanding questions around them, which also relate to the lack of peer-reviewed studies and lack of peer review of the modeling, the assumptions that go into the modeling, the way the models themselves are constructed, and how the results are interpreted. That, coupled with the lack of peer review, raise real questions around, the reliability of the proposals. Other issues, human error, human intrusion, future glaciation. What are the effects of those major changes over long periods of time? And there's a tendency to say that we have these uncertainties, so additional research must be done. But there was a very helpful overview of the technical work released by the United Kingdom Environmental Agency in 2009, and their I think very insightful conclusion was that, yes, more work needs to be done, but the work may or may not indicate that an acceptable safety case can be made. So for additional information, you can visit the nonuclearwaste.ca website, and that is a website which serves as a repository itself, but in this case of information about geological repositories, and in particular about the current efforts of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization to develop and cite and gain approval for a deep geological repository for high-level fuel waste here in Canada.